happiness, more or less. It's just a change in me, something in my liberty. Oh, my. Happiness coming and going. I watch you look at me, watch my fever growing, and I know just where I am. But how many corners do I have to turn? How many times do I have to learn? All the love that I had was in my mind. But I am a lucky man. Ladies and gentlemen, we are now floating once again in Screamacelica. It is an honour to say that me and Paul have managed to, well, we not managed to, we just never gave him the DeLorean back, that Kevin Graham. That is his name, right? I forgot, I can't even mind what he looks like.
I'm not sure.
To do the show, but
a mustard bobble hat from time to time. I remember that.
But it is the Boyce and Dixie combo for the second week in a row. We fast forwarded a couple of years for last week, but it all kind of ties in a wee bit because it means that we're sort of getting to the sort of end game for what I think this era of team was looking for. You know, under Tommy Burns, we're out the Lumicari darkness. I'm into a new era back at Celtic Park with a foreign sprinkle now beginning to take shape in the team amongst, a lot of other players that are perhaps now more established in the Celtic squad that we were talking about as, hot shots last season. So the game we are covering, Zinko, I love it, mate. We never give him it back. The game we're covering tonight is one that really stuck out vivid in my memories of being a child and going absolutely ballistic. In the living room, not at the game, Paul. I hope that's all right on the show. And it was Celtic 2, Dundee United 1, March the 10th, 1996, Scottish Cup quarter-finals. First things first, we left it late. But we were just talking off here there, Paul, about we felt this was the sort of surge of optimism that was about to come to, let's be honest, when you look at Celtic as a whole, or you look at a certain era, you've got to then look at what the knock-on effects of maybe eras without as many trophies then led to. And, we're in the mid-90s now, and we've now got a manager all the fans have bought into. We've now got Fergus McCann getting involved with the club and saving it from the brink. We've now got foreign international players in the team from countries none more so than Germany and Holland, of course, and now in the starting lineup at good ages as well, not these young projects that drive me nuts all the time. We've got this, and it feels like there's something happening because we're very much playing the rip-roaring style of football that we love. And you only need to look at, these were the building blocks happening there that has led since then to 2 decades, whether people like it or not, of, absolute dominance. When you look at what Celtics went on to achieve, and this was the foundations of all that. And I think we started to see how the new modern world Celtic was going to look. Just try to get your thoughts on that first.
This was a transitional period. You just have to look at the footage, and I know we'll talk about this when you see the stadium. For example, it was a transition period in terms of the creation of that Tommy Burns side. But in many ways, this was the finest season under Tommy Burns. Now, like you say, I'd already started going to the games as a season ticket holder. Yep. By the way, that's the big stamp of approval. Yes, season ticket holder. But that was all down to Fergus McCann because he introduced a different way of thinking, a different culture within the Celtic fan base in terms of season tickets. I mean, we spoke about the kinds of figures that you were talking about pre-Fergus. 1989, 6,000 season ticket holders. First season under Fergus was at Hampden, 17,000. We then come back to Paradise, and then it became the norm, Boyce, to become a season ticket holder. So the whole thing was definitely feeling like a transitional phase. But that team there that you've got, you're spot on when you say that there was the stardust, as I know you like to describe it as, being sprinkled onto the largely domestic-based squad. Yeah. And I made a point just before we came on. I remember, looking back to when we won the Scottish Cup in 1995 against Airdrie, I've spoken about that. Rudi Vata had forced his way into that side, of course, Albanian internationalist. Prior to that, Celtic didn't have many overseas players. I mean, we can't call Republic Island players foreigners. You know, they weren't. They were basically Irish players that played with Celtic, and there was plenty of them. So when you're looking at, you know, the two Polish players, Jackie and Shuggy, under Billy McNeil. Prior to that, Johannes Edvaldsson, Bent Martin, who, by the way, I don't even think he played. I know we signed him after he impressed against us in Europe. But very, very few overseas players represented Celtic. And then all of a sudden, there was this real conveyor belt of players coming in, and it was down to Tommy Burns. And this is the thing, just looking at this game and looking back, the foreign policy of bringing players in started under Tommy, really, in earnest. And obviously some of those players were pivotal to this particular game. But even then, the vast majority of the squad was Scottish. You know, you look at that Celtic squad, quite a few of them had come through the ranks, Boyce. Others had been domestic signings from other Scottish clubs. But as well as the aforementioned Rudi Vata, in that squad we had Morten Vikhorst, and we also had Pierre van Hooijdonk and Andreas Thom. But these guys were new recruits. You know, they had signed in this season, and later on in the season, famously, we also brought in George Cadet. And I'm sure we can mention a wee bit about that later on. So it was a time of optimism. You thought that it's a matter of time before we win the league. You go through this league campaign and lose one game.
I know.
And you think to yourself, it's going to be next season. You honestly thought it's going to be the following season that we're going to win the league. That's what you thought. And then you start looking at the fact that you've got the impact of Cadet, you bring in Di Canio. You know, people going about the Three Amigos, and we'll talk about this as well, Boyce. Sometimes you say the Three Amigos, but you forget about Andy Thom. Andy Thom was a supreme footballer. You know, he was the first Eastern German player to be capped by the unified Germany. When we brought him in, it was something of a coup, and I can only use an example that was given to me by someone who at that time was a young kid at Celtic. John Potter, who's now at Hibs, he's Jack Ross's number 2, and he said without a shadow of a doubt that Andreas Thom was the best striker of football he had ever seen, and quite frankly the best striker of football at Celtic Park at that time. And I think we saw that for ourselves on this particular occasion in this game.
But I think it's interesting because I was obviously looking at, we like to give a bit of background. It's not just about the one individual match as such. So did a bit of digging in the transfers that been made sort of that summer, or you forget, of course, no transfer window, Paul. Which I found quite interesting. There was a couple of things that stood out to me. Was we sold a player very regularly throughout that season. Players left for what you would describe as nominal fees. We can go through them just now. So Charlie Nicholas had left late summer. Paul Byrne even later in the summer. Tony Mowbray then left for 300,000 in October. Then Jamie McQuilquin for 150 grand. Barry Smith 100 grand. 50 grand for Mark McNally. Remember you touched on last week the Willie Faulkner one for £200,000. And then Andy Walker left in the February. So we were almost continually selling players as the season went on, which I think at times, see when clubs are struggling, I think this is going to become quite relevant maybe, you know, with the COVID stuff. I don't know, and maybe in other leagues, maybe in Scotland, you know, you think it's a brilliant vehicle to have that throughout the season. If you're struggling, you know, you look at the lack of revenue, a lot of these clubs, the loss of revenue a lot of these clubs will have had recently. Imagine if they do get in a sticky point through the season and be able to sell an asset for, okay, less than what they would like to, but not having to wait 3-4 months to a January window, or hang on for dear life, if not, you know, as long as they make it, to the close season window opening again. I found it quite interesting. I'd almost forgotten about signing players, you know, because I think it's been 16 years or something now the transfer window's been going for, and it's something I'd completely not forgotten, but you just get so used to it. I suppose it's like the pass back rule, just rules that you just take completely for granted in football now. And I find it quite interesting that Celtic were systematically selling players. Almost when you look at it, they sold a player a month is pretty much the ratio that whole season, which is I just find that fascinating.
It is, and when I'm speaking to people like yourself from your era as well, Boyce, I sometimes forget that things I take for granted, changes in the game like the pass-back rule, like the introduction of windows for transfers, haven't always been there for you, for me, but they've always been part and parcel of the game for yourself. And I sometimes forget that. But some of the players you mentioned there, I mean, Charlie Nicholas went to Clyde. He started sporting a ponytail. You might not remember that. So
I do remember it.
He was
now Rangers.
I think the game was maybe live.
And it was on Sky.
Yes.
I remember watching it.
Yeah, and he's just gliding about with this ponytail, which is something to behold. I mean, Charlie had some cracking hairdos, as you know, and that was one of the best. Paul Byrne, how we lost money on Paul Byrne, I'll never know, because we spoke about him last week coming in as a 90 grand bargain basement player. We actually lost money on him, and he teamed up with Mark McNally at Southend. Mowbray went to Ipswich, ended up playing alongside players like Stuart Slater and Bobby Pettar at Ipswich Town, and others within that. We've done okay, I think, to get £500,000 back for Andy Walker around about that time. And of course Mike Galloway had to retire through injury after being in a car crash. Lee Martin left, and I had to check there because I couldn't have told you where he went after Celtic, and it was Bristol Rovers. But he's a guy who obviously had a decent career at Man U, but it was hampered by injury, by the time he came up to Celtic. But you're right, I don't know why. I don't know what the reason is behind the transfer window. Is it really just to add another Hollywood element to the season? I mean, what is the reason for the window? Is it something obvious that I've missed? It could well be something that certain clubs might have to, if it wasn't there, they could use it to their advantage to survive, or, and other teams could strengthen, I guess. But at this moment in time, we are within a transfer window, as you know, and we're doing a lot less business within that short period of time than we would over an entire season, that's for sure, at the moment anyway, Boyce. But I think what Tommy Burns was doing, he was certainly streamlining the squad, and he was bringing in quality, because you look at the players he was bringing in, and every single one of them added something to the team. Yeah, absolutely. And even though they were all first team players, weren't they? Even though John Hughes, I always felt, was a stopgap. And he was actually a stopgap for Alan Stubbs eventually. But, you look at the quality of players we were bringing in, you knew that he was building something at that stage. I
think it's important, though, as well, when you touch on that. I think sometimes you need that. You only need to look. Brendan Rodgers literally brought Kolo Touré in for a Champions League qualifying campaign. Essentially, it was like, we need someone, we need them in now. And I always liked Hughes when I was growing up. I always liked him, one of those players, gave his all and all that.
John, I've always liked Mark Hughes. Well,
you've got to get it in, mate.
Always.
But yeah, so looking at the squad, the first 11 that started that day, and you're absolutely right, it's still predominantly a Scottish team. We've got Gordon Marshall in goals, so me and Kev gave pelters to a few weeks ago, I'm not going to lie. Jackie McNamara, a new signing, £650,000, who, I mean, it's a shame that Henrik Larsson cost the exact same amount, otherwise he would be the best £650,000 player you could have imagined. The years of service as well, and the variety of positions he played in. I mean, he's worth a show in himself, Jackie McNamara. For me, I thought he was becoming the reincarnation of him under O'Neill as well. I mean, we're doing a rabbit hole already, but the reincarnation of him under O'Neill, after looking like he was on the periphery, then coming back with the captain's armband at Ibrox. Great story. Love it. John Hughes and Brian O'Neill. Am I right in thinking he went on to Mönchengladbach, was it?
Listen, I'm not going to check that, and I'm going to say Wolfsburg. But I will now check to make sure if that's the case. But he definitely went to Germany, didn't he, Brian O'Neill?
Yeah. Brian O'Neill. Not one I remember as well. I remember him at the time, but I wouldn't be able to tell you if I thought he was a good player or not. But he was obviously held in a decent regard if he's going to the Bundesliga, Touch me. Yep, go on.
I just think with Brian O'Neill, I remember him coming through as a young player, but he'd already made a name for himself in that under-16 World Cup squad. So you knew about him, because I was at the game in the semi-final against Portugal where he scored the header that got us through, and that was at Tynecastle. And, he was one of the guys, I think, Brian O'Neill, who, we didn't quite know where to play him. So he played a lot of games at centre-half. I think he came into the side as a midfield player. He ended up at times being deployed up front. He scored famously the winner at Ibrox in a 2-1 game that was officially Lou Macari's first game in charge. Yeah, he did end up playing for Wolfsburg, right enough, and he was capped by Scotland. Yeah, but I just think with O'Neill, he was probably... He had a good career. You know, he did well in Germany and he ended up in England. Yeah, Derby. I remember his debut actually was in a friendly against Spurs under Liam Brady. It was Liam Brady that introduced him to the team, and him and Mark Donaghy were the two young guys that came through, and they played against Spurs. A Gary Lineker, Naeem inspired Spurs. I think we won that game 1-0, I think.
And Naeem, was he signed because he scored in the Cup Winners' Cup final against Arsenal for about 50 yards or something? Was it the same one?
That's the same guy, but that was after his Spurs career, actually.
Was that after?
Aye.
Oh, wow.
That was after his Spurs career.
Then.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
Nice one. Midfield, Simon Donnelly, Peter Grant, Paul McStay, Brian McLaughlin, and then the sprinkling of the magic dust up front, Andy Tom and a certain Pierre Van Hooijdonk. Pierre Van Hooijdonk was a player I wanted to talk about tonight, Paul.
Yes.
I remember when he signed from NEC Braid, I remember his debut was against Hearts. He scored an absolute fizzer. And it was a belter strike that. Van Hooijdonk was a guy, it was funny because it was like the Three Amigos. For all the fond memories you've got, you obviously always associate them with contract refusals. Were they perhaps a bit moody, to say the least, maybe in some cases? Were they in it for the dough, or did they get the Celtic bug? Now, retrospectively, as a lot of players tend to do, you hear an interview with them and they cannot wait to talk about their time at Celtic. But is that always the reality? Is that how it was when you were there? It's hard to tell. Obviously, we know the terms that he left on, but talking about his actual presence in the Celtic squad whilst he was there, phenomenal goal record that he had with us, wasn't it?
Aye, definitely. We spoke the other day when you were in the studio, Russell, about how vivid certain memories are in your own mind, but it's certain things that you remember about football. So I spoke to you about going to the games, and that had been after a long period of time where I wanted to go to the games, but my dad obviously didn't want to take me because that was his release from the drudgery of 5 long shifts doing a pit, and there's no way he was going to be dragging me along with him for a period of time. I eventually started going in 87, and my memory was that the bus we went on parked the usual miles away from the stadium, and then you had to walk down London Road, and basically my job was to follow a pair of sambas. And it was my dad's pair of sambas through an absolute, foresty legs. And you just kept an eye on these sambas all the way down London Road because you didn't want to lose your dad. And he knew that's what you were doing all the way down the road. And then the smells once you get to the burger vans and everything else. So you've got your own vivid memories of the games. And I've got a vivid memory of Van Hooijdonk's debut. So I travelled through that night on Jokey Munyon's bus. Jokey Munyon, great guy, absolute legend from the five villages. Yep. The thing with that, again, is that with a lot of Irish names, they changed over the years because a lot of the Irish coming to Scotland were illiterate, as a lot of people were back then. They were coming off a boat, they were given their name, it was misspelt, blah, blah, blah. So Monaghan became various different versions of Monaghan, and one of the versions was Monian. And there's a family, the Monians, who live in High Valleyfield in Fife. So he used to drive the bus. He was from Blair Hall, but he went in various wee spots in the West Fife villages picking people up, taking us through to the game. And this is, again, shows you all about eras, Russell, and how you start taking it for granted that as soon as that team is announced tomorrow against Sheffield Wednesday, one click on your phone, you'll see what the team is. Back then, Celtic signed a player called Pierre Van Hooijdonk, right? And you don't have the same means of finding out information about this guy. So at that time, you did rely on newspaper reports, right? So you're reading as much as you can on him. You knew we had signed him from Breda, and you didn't know a great deal about him. You always got the Celtic View on a Wednesday. I remember it was something as pivotal as how do you spell his name. That was one of the features in the View. Honestly, it was like you can spell it either with a Y or an IJ, you know. Great. Can he play? That's all we want to know. But when we signed him, like you quite rightly said, we played Hearts that night at Hampden, because we were playing their home games at Hampden Park. But on the way through to that game in the bus from Fife, everybody's talking about this fella because nobody knows him. We don't know who he is. And that was part of the magic. He could have been an absolute dumpling for all we know. Right?
Well, that's the interesting thing. Sorry to come in, but that's the interesting thing I want to touch on. You talk about different eras, right? Now, flip it into modern day Celtic, and we sign a guy from the Eredivisie who's got a record of 81 goals in 115 games.
Wow.
And they're 25 years old.
I know.
We would
Astonishing.
be pretty excited, I think, and probably looking at, and I wanted to touch on this as well, because this is why I love doing this show, because see when I'm looking at transfer fees from 95, that meant nothing to me growing up. Although as much as I remember his debut, and I can vividly remember it. Same with Cadetti's debut, I remember that. But transfer fees don't mean anything to an 8-year-old, 9-year-old boy. You know what I mean? They don't. I don't understand it. So he was £1.2 million. Now, I'm trying to think of the growth in the transfer market in terms of the inflation, the overinflation in a lot of cases, and then putting that into context with his track record, which was 33 goals and 69 at RBC, and then, which I'm going to guess were either top flight or second top flight in Holland, and then 81 goals for NEC. This guy's got over 100 career goals already in around 180 games. Now, we're bringing him in at 25 years old. I'm going to guess he's on the minds of the Dutch national team by this point because of the impact he's making. And we sign him for 1.2 million. Now, obviously, then tie that in with Celtic have been close to the brink. We tie that in with Fergus doesn't like spending money. And you're trying to work out the bang for the buck. And I'll leave that to you. But I just wanted to try and, there's the sort of quandary I was in today, trying to work all that out. Do you know what I mean?
Oh, definitely. At that time as well, you think about other players of a similar worth, a similar value who had come to Celtic. So we hadn't done too well when it came to £1 million plus signings. I think by that stage, probably the only one who had done a really good job for us was John Collins by this stage, you know, and he had signed way back in 1990. So, you know, 4 years before Van Hooijdonk comes in, right? Because he signed in November, didn't he? 1994. Is that right? That's just from memory. Aye. And so at that point, we had signed Collins, who was absolutely a hit. We had signed Stuart Slater, who was a miss, for 1.5. You know, Gary Gillespie came in for $1 million. Tony Cascarino, 1.1. Tony Mowbray, $1 million. I would give Tony Mowbray a pass. I've got to say, I think he played enough games, had, as you know, a big impact. He just didn't play for a successful side. But we'd signed £5 million plus players before Van Hooijdonk, and I would reckon only 2 of them were successes. Collins a big success, Mowbray a kind of medium success. So you were looking at that. It was still a big signing, even though it was only 1.2 million. It was still a big signing, and it got you excited. I later found out, because I read a lot of autobiographies, reading Kevin Keegan's, that you know, we had this idea in our mind, and you know, it was true that Tommy Burns had a phenomenal kind of scouting network, and part of that scouting network was the European scouts, and Davy Hay was involved in that, and Andy Ritchie was involved in it. And in that filing cabinet, we later found out, identified by the scouting network and Tommy Burns, was Paul Lambert and Craig Burley, who weren't signed by Tommy, but they were, you know, the legwork had been done. So I read in Kevin Keegan's book that Breda, or Van Hooijdonk's agent, had sent a videotape, a showreel of Van Hooijdonk to every top flight club in England, plus Celtic and Rangers. And obviously Celtic fancied it. But I know that we watched them because there was a policy in place. There was a policy in place that Fergus McCann had, which was, if we were going to sign a player, we had to watch him in person.
This is what I'm getting at, because they just can't envisage, you know, an unknown quantity getting an investment like that from Fergus McCann, you know? he joins, and it was actually January 95. He makes his debut against Hearts. I think it was January the 10th or something, right? And he goes on to score 4 goals in 14 games in his first season, right? But we get to the 95-96 season, and he is a Rolls Royce of a striker by this point. We better talk about the game. So, obviously, we're 1-0 down to Dundee United after absolutely battering them first half. Ali Maxwell may as well have collected the man of the match award at half time. Mm-hmm. That is the reality of it. But like I've always said to you when we do this, I always get nosy about the opposition. I always get nosy about who's playing for the other team and getting out a wee surprise. They're in the first division at this point.
I heard the commentary team saying that. And I was going to check whether they were in the first division or they'd just been promoted from the first division. But looking at the Premier League right now, I'll tell you, and you're right, yeah, they were still a first division side at this point.
And they've got Craig Brewster up front with Gary McSwegan. Mm-hmm. And I'm going, they're both two players I would always associate in my memories of being SPL strikers. Obviously, I know Brewster went abroad for a while, but that would be Maurice Malpass is playing at the back. There's strength in there. Celtic took them to task that first half, and I just felt watching it. Did I see a microcosm, or when you just see the whole season in that first half? Brilliant football, great to watch. But
winning nothing. No, you're right.
Winning nothing, not getting the ball in the net. And it's I can't remember that word is, but it's the word that I would use, a microcosm or whatever it is, something like that. And that's to describe that first half feels like the tail of the 90s, either the 95-96 season almost, or one defeat. You're going, this is unbelievable. One defeat, and you've lost the league. Not even 4 points you've lost the league by in the end. And I just wonder if at times, but then to flip it, Van Hooydonk's scoring goals for fun. Was he getting helped out in the goal trail as much?
I think the big thing here, when you look at it, is it was quite clear. You've read the Celtic team out on the bench, Malcolm Mackay. That shows you how thin we were at the back. Now, when you think of the Tommy Burns teams, you think of the Three Amigos, you think of Tom, they're all attacking players. And you don't think of a great goalkeeper. If Tommy Burns had a great goalkeeper, we'd have won the league that season. You're only talking, 4 points, 11 draws, right? So, yeah, Van Hooydonk's banging the goals in. Yeah. Even in this game, Gordon Marshall tried his best to sell the jerseys. Gives away the penalty. Ridiculous, gives away I know he saves it, right? But it was hit straight at him. And, I've said this before. Stuart Kerr was coming through at the time. Pat Bonner was on his way out. He'd been given an additional maybe 18 months by Tommy Burns, a couple of years. And our number one was Gordon Marshall. And this, for me, was the reason that we didn't win the league this season. And I'm not blaming him per se as an individual, but it was a defensive issue that we had. So you look at the first thing that I noticed was the state of the pitch. It was what Fran Alonso would describe as a tatty field, right? But you look at that Tommy Burns side, and we talk about the rip roaring and the entertaining, the free flowing. Look at the two fullbacks, Boyce. One signed for the Pars, one signed for the Jambos, up and down the wings. That's a traditional Celtic element, the overlapping fullbacks. And it's something that some people say, it started with the Lisbon Lions. It was probably at its most prevalent at that stage with the Lisbon Lions, with Jim Craig and Tommy Gemmell. But Duncan Mackay came before, and he played in great sides before, the Lisbon Lions and before Jock Stein arrived. He was a overlapping right back. Some people reckoned he invented the overlapping right back. Duncan Mackay's name was. And so that was a tradition at Celtic after that, wasn't it? You look at the right backs from Jim Craig. He was replaced by Danny McGrain, who was replaced by Chris Morris in the centenary year. That's only 3 right backs for the 60s right up to the centenary year. Incredible. That became a tradition. And when you look at some of the play, Jackie set up both goals in this game against Dundee United. He wins the ball for the winner, and we'll talk about that. But it was his play on the right-hand side. He won the free kick. He lofts the free kick in for Big Pierre. But he and McKinley were playing in the finest traditions of Celtic Football Club, up and down the flanks, unbelievable engines, and I was going to say brilliant in the attack as well. But what a chance McNamara had one-on-one with Maxwell, and he about hit the corner flag with it. But I just think when you're looking at it, the key for me, if it's 4 points, right, then it's down to no being able to turn a draw, because we drew 11 games, into a win often enough. And sometimes that was because the back door wasn't shut. Gordon Marshall and the central defensive area were weak. I mean, we started that game with Hughes and O'Neill. You know, that for me is not a strong enough backline. And Tommy Burns knew it, because he went out and spent big money on Alan Stubbs the following season.
£4 million, wasn't it, on Stubbs? I think you're absolutely right. And I think that's a rational way of looking at it. I think, obviously, we had a great show, and we spoke about when Cadeti broke the radio waves, you know, on 5 Live. I love all that. Of course, so you've got.
And he does this, Boyce. He does this.
Oh, so good. But I think there's the flip side is, you know, I like to be in the real world, right, and look at what we could do better. But you've got to admit that the Cadeti was potentially the game changer, the same way you're talking about the back. Put him in the team for some of those draws, and there's your point, clawed back straight away, because it's not like he didn't hit the ground running. I think he got 5 and 8 at the tail end of that season. You know, he was off like a greyhound, you know what I mean? Straight out the traps. So there's two elements to it.
You're right.
A bit hard done by.
Oh, massively.
But undoubtedly, we need to look at our flaws. So the equaliser scored by Van Hooijdonk in the 89th minute, towering header, straight down. Van Hooijdonk was a player at that point who could mix it, but also had finesse, Paul. Regarded still as one of the best free kick takers of all time. Had a far better strike rate than David Beckham, which I remember I found that out at high school before Rangers played Feyenoord. It was a quote, it was said on the telly, the radio, and I said, better not give him a free kick tonight. I mean, he's got a better strike rate than David Beckham. I went, that was the part I told. I don't know who'd said it, but someone had said it. And I was like, shut up, he's old, he's rubbish now. And of course he went and scored two carbon copies. Mm-hmm. But watching his career after Celtic, it's funny, because Van Hooijdonk could have went horribly wrong for. He goes to Forest, they get relegated, he smashes it up front to Kevin Campbell. I think he got 25 goals, something like that, or 34 goals in fact he got. 34 goals in the equivalent of the Championship. I mean, again, would that be a player we let go for $3.5 million that would be worth 15 at that point with that many goals now? You'd be kicking yourself. But of course then he does his strike thing. And I remember that so vividly, that he basically, they were selling the best players but wouldn't sell him. So he just went and started training with NAC Breda again, refused to play. That could have went horribly wrong for him. He ends up coming back in. He goes back to Holland to rebuild his career at Vitesse. 25 goals, one season there. Before you know it, he's earned a big bucks move again. He's in Benfica. He's there for a year with George Cadeti up front.
Incredible, eh?
Always a Celtic connection. He gets 19 goals there. And before you know it, he's back in Holland with Feyenoord. They then win the UEFA Cup that season that he scores the 2 past Klos. He then goes to the Turkish Premier League and is apparently one of Fenerbahce's favourite players of all time. He is like a legend over there. Smashes the goals, wins 2 Turkish Super Leagues, which turn out to be the only top-flight leagues he wins in his career, which I found quite interesting as well. But I wonder, there's 2 sides to it. You look back and you think of the Three Amigos and cult hero, or is it really befitting of a Celtic player when you look at how we were formed to be making quotes like $7,000 maybe of use to a homeless man, but not an international striker? What did that, when that was said at the time, again, I've got no context to these quotes, do you know what I mean? I vaguely remember that I'd probably heard of it later on in my life about the quote. When I read it, it was a wee bit familiar, but I'm trying to think back again. We're in the time machine, 1996, and he's saying that to force his move out. What sort of taste does that leave in the Celtic fans' mouth?
I mean, just as bad a taste as it would now, to be honest. But the difference is...
Scott Bates, do you know what?
Apparently and allegedly. But the thing is, Boyce, back then, I mean, you were basically just, talking into very, very small echo chambers. So, if you had a view on something, you're talking about it within a household, within a pub, within a supporters bus. So it was difficult then to gauge collectively what the Celtic support was feeling. And even then, I mean, because you couldn't do that through the pages of the Celtic View, you certainly couldn't do it through the mainstream newspapers. And the fanzines were monthly. So, I mean, it all goes back to technology and what content creation was back then. So you would get letters written and sent into fanzines. You would have great kind of editorials in the fanzines. I've said it a million times, Not the View was my go-to. And so, yeah, Celtic fans certainly didn't miss him when it came to comments like that. But let's be under no illusion, I had some great memories of Van Hooijdonk. Watched his debut, tail end of that season. I thought, and I've not checked this, but I thought he scored 9 goals at the tail end of the first season. He certainly scored against Airdrie in the final, famous one.
He scored 4 league goals.
4 league goals. So 8 in total. It's all right. And I always remember one of the things where you know that Celtic fans have taken you to their heart, like Willie Faulkner, Willie Faulkner, is you have a song for an individual player. Pierre, there's only one Pierre. And they used to sing this. And I always remember a big mate of mine who, I don't know if I went to any or many games with him, but we both had season tickets and we went to school together. We played football together. His name is Wes Thompson. And big Wes, he bore a striking resemblance to Pierre Van Hooijdonk. So when he used to come to see me at half time for a pie and a blether, and he was walking down the Hampden turnstiles behind the goals, the Celtic fans used to sing to my big mate Pierre, and he would go down and give it the Hulk Hogan Hulkamania. So I had great memories of Van Hooijdonk, but let's be under no illusion, the guy was a mercenary, bottom line. Total and utter mercenary. And not only that, comment, he went to Turkey. He's obviously at some point seen Nadir Çiftçi, and he convinced Celtics to spend millions of pounds on him as well. But
that's right, he's a football
he was a mercenary, a total mercenary back then. And there's some occasions, I think, where players are done wrong by the Pravda machine back then, and love him or loathe him, Charlie Nicholas, for years Celtic fans thought he couldn't get out of Celtic Park quickly enough, but the story was slightly different when you hear it from both sides, and that happened as well. But in the case of Pierre, absolute mercenary, and he just used Celtic, no doubt about that. Yeah,
and it is interesting because I think these people then come up and they promote the Scottish Cup or something like that, do you know what I mean, with the sponsor boards in their hand, and they talk about it being the happiest time of their life and things like that. And I always feel with a lot of the football interviews you see, I feel a lot of revisionism goes on with players, and perhaps it is though real, because you can only take people at that point in time where their head's at, and maybe it does take you to look back and go, actually that was brilliant. So it's maybe telling the truth now, but I always found it interesting because I always had the vibe that he was following the dollar his whole career. I mean, the list of clubs I've just told you about there, Paul, 2 spells at Feyenoord they ended up having. He went back there after Fenerbahce. So Benfica, Forest, who are an EPL club at the time, Celtic. You're thinking of those signing on fees, mate. You're moving almost on an 18-month basis. You're joining another big European league, another huge club within that league. He must have made a pretty bit. No wonder he wanted to be an agent.
I'll tell you this much as well, though, right? As much as we've praised the late great Tommy Burns for starting the real influx of foreign imports to Celtic Park, what came with it was a culture and an attitude of this mercenary footballer. Because when you look at that, you look at that Celtic squad as it is back then, players such as Peter Grant, even Collins. I mean, Collins eventually left after giving Celtic good service. Paul McStay, these guys, there wasn't a mercenary nature to them back then, and we associated that nature to the imports, Russell. But now I look at football and it's right across the board. It doesn't matter if you're domestic, if you're a youth player that's come through the ranks, homegrown, it's all about the dollar. And that's the biggest and saddest element of this. When you look back, there was still an element of innocence back then. There was still an element of players like Jackie McNamara, and this was obviously his first season. He went on to get a testimonial because there was the loyalty. Exactly. There was that loyalty which is missing in the modern game, and it doesn't matter if it's an import or if it's a domestic player. It's just part of the game now. We see behaviours of footballers, and on and off the park, that you think you're untouchable. You don't really care about any one club, and I think there's a great analogy that was given about how a dog is loyal to its owner, whereas a cat's loyal to its environment. And you think, at the end of the day, the cat doesn't care who's feeding it, and I think footballers are a bit like that.
No, I think it's a brilliant point. And I think, when you look at modern football now, it is littered with Van Hooijdonks. Mm-hmm. Absolutely littered with them now. He was maybe ahead of the curve in that way. He maybe thought, go there, and then you kick up a fast move there. I keep getting big checks every time I move, as well as, I'm going to imagine, monumental wages that the likes of Forest who are fighting to stay in the Premier League. I think when he joined them, and the EPL riches had really started to kick in then with Sky and stuff as well. You don't go to clubs like Benfica and Fenerbahce on buttons either, are you? So it's interesting. I mean, his goal record 56 and 92 overall for Celtic. It's a decent strike rate, isn't it? He did a lot of good, but he left. I just think he left a bad taste in the mouth with the nature of his...
Don't go there, bad taste in the mouth. The thing again, it was the three amigos, and this is what Fergus was getting at. I think the one that I've got a bit of sympathy for is George Cadet, right? Or Cadetti, whereby he, I don't think, was 100% making the decisions in that scenario. He was being dominated by his partner at that time. And we found that out after the event. But at the time, it was they're all as bad as each other. The three of them are the three amigos. But I got told a really interesting story by Tom Campbell, the great Celtic historian, who obviously lives in Canada. And Tom does things like, if he wants an interview, sometimes he'll just go and chap the person's door, right? Because that's how he operates. And if Tom Campbell chaps your door, you would let him in because he's the nicest man on the planet, right? And he found out where Fergus McCann resided in Canada. And this was, let's say in the last 10, 15 years, he thought, I'm going to go and ask him for an interview for a book that I'm writing. And then he described the area of Canada. I can't say for sure where it is. And at the bottom of this long road, at the top of the road was where Fergus resided. At the bottom of the road, there's a tavern called the Three Amigos. He says, now that's either a really big coincidence or that's something that was in Fergus's mind when he coined that phrase when speaking about the aforementioned Three Amigos.
That is brilliant. I love stuff like that. That's too good. Too good. Brilliant. Anyway, I think that covers the football. I wanted to do a wee feature on Pierre. We've covered the stadium. And, that is one other thing I wanted to talk about. So, the stadium, obviously, you notice when Andy Toms scores that fantastic win in the 91st minute. We're looking at a Celtic Park still very much in progress. As nice as it is to be home from Hampden, I want to know what the parallels like, because see, when you watch that, if you can't see that stand that's in getting, all the work done to it right at that point in time, and you just hear the noise, you're convinced Celtic's done. Like, if you just had that as an audio, Celtic Park is done. It's complete. The 60,000 stadium vision has came to the fore, and we are now in that beautiful stadium at full capacity. Of course, the actual attendance is 32,753, I think it was. So, what was it?
Double it. You know what I mean? Double that. And that crowd, Boyce, later in the season blew the radio waves. Imagine it was double the decibels. It's incredible.
It is, and I wanted to get from your point of view, like you touched on last week, because I think you're saying you became a season ticket holder. You're now probably, is this your first season at Celtic Park, or maybe your
first season as a season ticket holder? And I had started going in 1987, like I said before, and this is where my Celtic supporting life's been synonymous with Tommy Burns, because the first game I went to was Tommy Burns' testimonial. First time I got a season ticket, Tommy Burns as a manager. First trophy I actually physically seen us lifting was the 1995 Scottish Cup under Tommy. So when you go back, I think what's happened is there's a great video, and we'll cover this at a later date as well, called We're Back. And I think we play Newcastle and it's the opening of the North Stand, basically. And when you're there, you're just so glad to be back, in actual fact. Back at your spiritual home after a really poor season at Hampden, that it didn't really matter that there was temporary stands and so forth, and things were still being constructed, because it was your first opportunity to get in the stadium and see what Fergus McCann had seen. To actually see it, you'd seen the pictures and all that kind of stuff, and the Celtic View was always showing you the progress of Celtic Park. But you wanted to be there, Boyce, just to see it, even though it was unfinished. You wanted to see this cathedral just growing like a phoenix, rising through the ashes, and that vision. Like I was saying to you before, that memory walking down London Road and following the Sambas from behind. When you walk down London Road now and you get that first vision of paradise, it's just incredible, because that foresight and that vision was Fergus McCann's. Unbelievable.
Yes, so as amazing as all that is, what I'm wanting to do is contrast and compare then. When you're getting an atmosphere generated like what we were at this match that in particular we're talking about, or the Cadeti one later in the season, what was it like then when you first went in and it was 60,000?
It was more of a cauldron. I know that sounds kind of obvious, but again, some people might not like what I'm going to say here, but I remember walking into Ibrox for the first time and feeling that the atmosphere was different. It felt more kind of like enclosed, almost like you were in a theatre, rather than an open air event, if you like.
Yes.
And of course, my first open air concert that I ever went to was at Celtic Park as well, when I went to see U2 in 1993. But that feeling of going into a full house, I've got to say, it was more of a cauldron, but I had felt that when I had gone to Ibrox before. And I'm not going to try and compare and say that their stadium is better, but let's be honest, Celtic Park was a decrepit stadium, and we had no decadence at all about it previous to the rebuild. So when you went in and it was enclosed like that, take that a stage further, Boyce. Imagine it was enclosed further with the roof being level all the way around the stadium, encompassing the main stand.
I know.
And I think that development, I think Peter Lawwell said that would cost £17 million of an investment to get that extra tier, really, to redevelop the main stand properly.
There's no way he was going to do that.
No, they've not. And it's one of the things that, as much as I love the stadium as it is now, I always imagine that the roof being level all the way around.
Aye.
And taking it to another level again. So you've seen the atmosphere that it was, the atmosphere that you got when you went back, the racket that could be created, and closing all that, tremendous. But imagine taking it up another notch, and I think you could do that.
I know, I agree with you. I mean, it's got to be exciting, even the thought of something like that, definitely. As you say, when you've lived through it, when you've went, well, we've seen it when it's been, 32,000 for an absolute riot, and then it's doubled 5 years later to 60,000. I mean, you then think of the potential if you develop the main stand. What would you get up to, 70, 75? 75,
and you could do the sums, I guess, in terms of how long it would take to actually come back. How many games would need that capacity? I think that's what the club are trying to balance. In Scottish football, you've got 2 home games that would guarantee to meet that capacity. European games, depending on which European platform you're playing on, because not every European game sells out. So obviously it's a balancing act. It's the first thing that would happen if we ended up going elsewhere.
It would be amazing. I love that. We'll get on to the music, Paul.
Shall we?
Why not, mate? Why not?
Golden era, mate. Golden era.
Well, it was one that it was like, who'd you choose from this when there was so many? And I just thought, I could be quite stereotypical what I go for at times. So I just thought, let's look at the charts this week. And number 1 was Morning Glory, which, for as much as it, defines my musical taste is so much. Nobody wants to hear me talking about Oasis again unless we do our own Oasis special, Paul,
Nice wee hint.
But Alanis Morissette is at number 2 with Jagged Little Pill.
Something's occurred to me. I will not stop you in your tracks, but I'll come back to it regarding Alanis Morissette's connection to Celtic.
Oh, yes. Love it.
I'm going to write it down.
Pill's at number 2. and it goes on to sell 33 million records. It's her third album. The other two were a bit dancey, apparently. I didn't have a chance to listen to them, thankfully, but apparently they were a completely different sort of genre. So my takeaway from listening to it was, first and foremost, you forget about some of the bigger songs, right? Like, so the first track I didn't recognise at all, and then Ought to Know kicks in, and I thought, man, my foot's tapping. I quite like it. I'm not going to lie, I like Ought to Know. And then the other song I liked was Head Over Feet, which is where the title of the album comes from, because that's where she mentions like a jagged little pill in it. And what my takeaway was, music was evolving at this point in time. People were finding out a formula that was proven popular. I could be wrong here, but this is what I took from it, right? And chords and guitars were the part of the formula to make a hit record. You've seen, this was around the time the emergence of Sheryl Crow, things like that.
Yes.
Robbie Williams had released an album, I think, the year before with tracks like Old Before I Die, which were very much based on the sort of three-chord wonder sort of technique. And I just thought, there's a sound about the next. Meredith Brooks had that song called Bitch, and I remember that being very much of that formula as well. And I just think I don't want to take out the three for the musicians, because obviously they've got to do what they've got to do. In fact, it would be quite nice if there was a renaissance, even a bit of that, because it means even pop songs were half decent, even if you knew sometimes there wasn't much soul behind how they've came up with the formula. I dare say Alanis Morissette wrote all her tracks herself, fair enough. She was only 21 when this album came out.
Incredible. I think you make a great point. You make a great point there. The formula was your traditional kind of like what you would regard as indie stroke rock music. It was for somebody like Robbie Williams to come out of a boy band, right, and go more towards indie pop than just your bubblegum pop, I think proves the point. I think it's a great point. I never really thought about that.
So I was just thinking of the era and going, there's a lot of, mainstream hits playing music of that sort of that ilk. It just stood out to me. The album itself, though, has a lot of very good tracks on it, right? Yeah. I wasn't as familiar, and it just took me back to like summer holidays or Easter holidays at my house in Celtic Park, my living room, and like my mum maybe like doing like, I don't know, housework, doing the iron, and that being blaring. We had an amazing sound system in our living room, which I always think helps you get drawn into music if the sound quality of it's really good. Songs get more of a chance on your palate, I think, than what they do if you're listening to it in the headphones, the earphones that you got with your phone. For example, if a rubbish song comes on, you kind of, you just skip past it straight. Whereas you always give them more of a chance if you can hear all the instruments proper, you've got a good bass coming through. So we had a few big speakers sort of dotted about, and I always remember Jagged Little Pill was my mum's favourite at the time. But I look back and think, my mum was only like 31 then. She's like my age then. Do you know what I mean? Which is insane to be thinking like that. Do you know what I mean? Like, same age as me, and I'd like me running about the house. That would be a nightmare. Do you know what I mean? That would be a nightmare. So a lot of nostalgia listening to Jagged Pill that I wasn't expecting, because as I say, I wasn't familiar with the titles of all the tracks. But then when she listened to you, went, oh yeah, I kind of remember that slower one. But I felt her songwriting, her lyrics were very clever. She is way ahead mentally of a 21-year-old. The song Ironic, which obviously is extremely popular, is cleverly done. And it does show you the balances of everything that's kind of is, on paper good in life. And then you caveat it with, but you'll become an arse, basically, if you're loaded. Do you know what I mean? That sort of thing. So it was an enjoyable album. And I'm sure if anyone who's watching does revisit it, they'd probably they'd get a bit of pleasure out of listening to it. Or maybe just for that trip down memory lane.
Well, that's right. It's one of the things that I always remember thinking about it almost being like a breakup album for women, and they're basically they're venting at every man in the universe. But obviously, I'm not a woman, so I don't know if that is the case, although I've been likened to several as doppelgangers. But, I'm looking at that particular album, and I'm going to have to share a wee story with you, Boyce, right?
Yeah.
And just while you're talking, I had one eye on the lyric sheet of that particular album because I'm looking for the lyric that this is relevant to, and I can't find it, but someone out there will be able to identify it. So Alanis Morissette, as you know, is Canadian. And when she attended school, her English teacher was Tom Campbell. Tom Campbell, the Celtic historian, retired teacher, and he was Alanis Morissette's teacher, and he taught her English. So he speaks about her in glowing terms and knew her family, good Catholic family, knew them well, remembers that she was always musical and she was also into drama and acting and all this kind of stuff. And Tom speaks really, really fondly of Alanis Morissette.
That's amazing.
Tom believes that one of the lyrics on this particular album is about him. I can't find the lyric. It's something to do with looking over glasses or something. I can't find the lyric. But it does appear on the album. Because when Tom is telling me, and when a guy like Tom tells you something, it's the truth. What's he got to prove? He's about 84 years of age. But yeah, Tom Campbell was Alanis Morissette's school teacher.
I love this, man.
And he wrote The Glory and the Dream, which was a Celtic history book that was released in time for Celtic centenary season.
There is always a connection.
There's always a link to the famous Glasgow Celtic.
That's so good. That is, I mean, try to imagine teaching someone like that. Obviously, a big part of songwriting is your ability at literature and being able to write. If you'd been their English teacher, firstly, no wonder you'd be thinking, I better be in that album. But secondly, what an amazing sense of pride. And I'm not trying to be cheesy, but you would feel like you've played some sort of small part in. And like, what did I just say to you before that? I felt the lyrics were extremely clever. I felt in a lot of songs they were ahead of our time. You know, you pick that up from how you've been taught English to an extent, you know, and obviously then what music you listen to and stuff as well. But he's played a part in a 33 million record-selling album.
It's
one of the biggest selling albums of all time.
I know, it's frightening. I'm trying to remember who I was watching an interview. I watch interviews, as you know, all the time, and I was watching a Dave Grohl interview, and he was talking about how a band in the UK feel as though they've made it if they make it in the US, and he was explaining how a US band feels they've made it if they make it in the UK. I've never thought about it like that. And Alanis Morissette certainly did. It was a huge selling album in the UK as well, Boyce. I think I've seen her actually. Here you go. Foo Fighters drummer was her drummer at Tina Park. The Foo Fighters drummer was Alanis Morissette's drummer at Tina Park. Aye, definitely.
Wow. There you go. So you've seen her live?
I've seen her at Tina Park live, yep.
What year would that have been?
Same year Robbie Williams played, probably. Was that about the same time that Williams brought out his debut? He came on with a Mohican, he came on with a Travis Bickle wearing a black Adidas tracksuit. Robbie Williams, yes. I've seen Alanis. He didn't wear it as well as you, mate. Yeah. That's for sure.
Over to you, mate.
Well, you know, you look at some of these years and you think, wow, that was a really poor year for music. And I've heard you and Kevin complaining about some of the later years and how you're going to struggle to pull out albums. And then you look at this particular period. So what's the story? Morning Glory sitting at number 1 in the charts. I could talk for hours about that album and its relevance to the soundtrack of my life. Number 2, Jagged Little Pill. Again, yeah, I agree with you. Great album when you listen back. If you are not a music snob, Russell, which I like. And so if you like a band that you know are cutting edge, it's because you like them, not because you want to be trendy or, in the know or all that kind of stuff. But by the same token, if you like a song that maybe is popular or something like Jagged Little Pill, you'll say you like the album, you don't care. There's no snobbery there. There's a lot of snobbery in music, isn't there? So you look through the charts expecting to fly by the Blue Tones. I thought was a tremendous debut album, right along the whole Stone Roses kind of trail at that time. Yeah. Stanley Road by Paul Weller. Some think that was his real return to form, even though Wild Wood had came out before it, which is a phenomenal album. Pulp with Different Class, you could go on. Unbelievable. But I decided to go with not History by Michael Jackson, but The Bends. The Bends by Radiohead. And the reason for that was that, also Jollification by Lightning Seeds. Let's not mention the Lightning Seeds at this moment in time. Cast by All Change. Bjork came out with Post. Brilliant. It's just album after album after album. The Ghost of Tom Joad by Bruce Springsteen. But anyway, I went with The Bends by Radiohead. And the reason I went for that was I remember Radiohead kind of coming into my consciousness, and it was through a lot of albums at that time, Russell. It was through my brother. So my brother was working because he was older. He was working. There was that staggered thing where he had money before I did. He was buying clothes and records before I was. I went to the football before he did because I had priorities, mate, So the Bends, I'd already been introduced to Radiohead through Pablo Honey, the debut album. And what I would suggest to anybody who maybe got into Radiohead or has got a passing interest in it is that the first 3 albums, mate. Now, I've said this before on this show and elsewhere. My main interest in many, many bands lasts for 3 albums. I don't know why, but I just get into the band for 3 albums and then I kind of go somewhere else, lose a bit of interest. But there are some bands that I stick with throughout their entire career, into their solo careers. I dig out their bootlegs and their B-sides and unheard tracks and all that stuff. But mainly, I'm into a band for 3 albums. And the first 3 Radiohead albums are just astonishing. So Pablo Honey, if you read the reviews of the debut, people think it's a flawed album. There's some songs on it that are generic. I don't necessarily agree with that. I think it's a fantastic album. But it's famous for that single that was a worldwide hit, Creep, right? So everybody knew about Radiohead because of Creep. But then they released The Bends. And it's just like, I still, and I know that people will disagree, I still think it's the best Radiohead album. Every track on it, you just think, now, because of the journey and the route that they went down, I still think they could write another Bends at the drop of a hat. I think they could write another Bends style album in their sleep, but they choose not to because they're just so accomplished as musicians and it would probably bore them and they don't want to repeat themselves. So I get all that. But just for sheer bliss and accessibility and non-snobbery, the Bends, for me, is Radiohead's finest album. They went on, obviously, to release OK Computer, which got all the awards and took them on this journey of a wee bit more experimentation, I think. But they are still one of the finest bands of my generation. But that clutch of 3 albums, Pablo Honey, The Bends, OK Computer, is almost as perfect as the first 3 albums that I can think of. The Verve had an almost perfect first 3 albums, and I think I think that Oasis, although kind of flawed, had 3 brilliant first 3 albums. But anybody that hasn't immersed themselves in those first 3 Radiohead albums, go and do it. Outrageous. And this is the pick of the bunch for me.
Yeah. What's the highlights in the album?
Well, you could be obvious, I guess, and go for a lot of the kind of big hitting singles. But for me...
Street Spirit was on that? Was that?
Yeah, Fade In. And you've also got... You've got Fake Plastic Trees, which is like a perfect song. A perfect song. And Tom York, again, have a listen to some of the interviews that he's given. From a very young age, suffering from a lazy eye, having to go for loads and loads of operations on that, and being taunted and all the rest of it for looking a wee bit different and all this kind of stuff.
That's all right.
He could have had operations as a young kid where his eye would have looked perfect, but he wouldn't have had much vision in it. So what he's gone for is near to perfect vision, but obviously the eyelid and all that droops and stuff like that. But the guy's a genius. The guy is an artistic genius, and he's had tragedy. His wife died of cancer at a young age and all this kind of stuff. Tremendous band, visually, musically and sonically. I mean, I just think... On the one hand, I think, I wish they would make another album like this. But on the other hand, you've got to admire the fact that they've pushed the boundaries and pushed the envelope, album after album after album, never repeating themselves. So, brilliant. Anybody that's out there that thinks they're a bunch of weirdos, they probably are, but great music.
Well, on that note, I think we will leave it there. That has been another over an hour again, man. Just like that.
Always.
Once you're floating in Screamacelica, that's you away. You're just away, man. It's great.
This is for a future episode, Dan the Man. We'll come back to this debate. We'll come back to this debate.
We have got plans, mate. We've got plans. But no, a big thanks to everyone who's watched, everyone who's been in the comments. Hopefully Kev's going to come out the wilderness and be back next week. If not, I'll just keep hold of DeLorean for another Tuesday night, mate. All right. Thanks again to everyone.
Loved it. Thank you, Boyce.
Cheers.